Asa was born in a turbulent time when true faith was like a lamp flickering in the wind, about to go out. He was Abijah's son, Rehoboam's grandson, a direct descendant of Solomon and David. His blood carried the heritage of powerful kings, but also the shadow of wrong decisions that had weakened Judah. His grandfather Rehoboam had divided the kingdom. His father Abijah ruled for a short time, maintaining instability, and then the throne fell to Asa. He was a young man when he took the crown, and soon realized that the kingdom he had inherited was far from the glory of his ancestors. Jerusalem, once resplendent with the temple of the Lord, was now surrounded by strange altars, sacred poles, and statues of pagan gods. The people were divided. Some still followed the traditions of their fathers, but many had given themselves over to foreign rites, sacrificing on hills, lighting incense to deities that had nothing to do with the God of Israel. Check out more Bible stories full of emotion by subscribing to the channel now and activating the bell to receive all notifications. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with a donation by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. Asa watched it all. His eyes roamed the land that was supposed to be holy and saw corruption, injustice, and a faith mixed with deceit. Perhaps he could simply rule like those who came before, leave things as they were, maintain the policy of convenience that so many kings practiced. But something was burning inside him, a flame that wouldn't allow him to stand still. He knew that if he chose the more difficult path, he would face resistance. Powerful people would oppose him. Even within his own family, there were those who preferred foreign customs. But Asa didn't want to be just another name forgotten in the records of kings. He wanted something bigger, something real, and so he made a decision that would change the course of Judah's history. He looked at his land and knew he had to start. But before any action could be taken, there would come the first challenge, facing what remained of his people's faith and deciding whether they were ready to face all that was to come. Before Asa could even raise his hand to change anything, he had to face an uncomfortable reality. Judah was far from being a kingdom faithful to the Lord. The people walked along streets that led to the temple, but their hearts belonged to other gods. There were years and years of permissiveness, where idolatry not only existed, it reigned. Sacred poles were erected on every corner, representations of foreign deities adorned houses, and even on the highest hills, where once the people cried out to the God of Israel, stone altars dedicated to Baal and Asherah could now be seen. Sacrifices were made, incense burned, and the customs of the neighboring peoples blended into the routine of Judah as if they had always existed there. But there was something even worse. The spiritual corruption came not only from the people, but from the leaders themselves. The priests were divided. Some still remained faithful to the God of their ancestors, but others bent to pagan practices in exchange for power and influence. Even the royal family was involved. The queen mother, Maacah, had her own idol, a shameful object of worship that she kept in a sacred place. For Asa, this was an affront. He saw all this and knew that a change needed to happen. But where to start? How to root out a belief that had seeped so deep into the hearts of the people? How to confront powerful priests, influential nobles, and even his own grandmother? Asa couldn't ignore what was before his eyes. The truth was clear. The people were far from God. And as long as this continued, Judah would never know true peace. It was then that he decided to act. But to restore the people's faith, Asa would have to take measures that no one before him had had the courage to take. Asa didn't hesitate. If Judah's heart was contaminated, then he would root it out. And he wouldn't start softly with gentle words or polite requests. No, the king knew he had to be firm, so he ordered all the pagan altars to be destroyed. Every sacred pole, every image of foreign gods, everything was to be torn down and reduced to dust. The first to feel the weight of his decision were the priests who had exchanged the Lord for empty rituals and sacrifices to strange deities. Their makeshift temples were raided, their offerings burned, and their idols smashed. Many resisted, shouting that this was a mistake, that the gods of the nations also brought blessings. But Asa was not fooled. He knew the history of his people. He knew that every time Israel had followed other gods, ruin had followed. The destruction of the idols went on throughout the land. The people watched in silence. Some were terrified, fearing that the gods would turn against them. Others felt an inexplicable relief, as if deep down they knew they were returning to something they should never have left. But the greatest proof of Asa's determination came when he turned his eyes inward to the palace itself. The queen mother, Maacah, was furious. How dare he touch her faith? How dare he stand up against his own family? Her personal idol, an obscene image that she kept for worship, was a symbol of her influence. But Asa didn't give in. He had the sculpture destroyed and Maacah removed from her position of honor. No other king before him had done anything like this. Asa wasn't just cleansing Judah of foreign gods. He was declaring that from that moment on, only one name would be honored in the kingdom, the name of the Lord. And as the altars crumbled and the ashes of the idols were scattered by the wind, a new question arose in the hearts of the people. If God was back at the center of the nation, what would happen now? When the last idols were broken and the dust settled, something unexpected happened. Instead of revolt, fear, or lamentation, the kingdom of Judah experienced something it hadn't known for a long time: peace. A deep peace, like a river that finally finds its course after years of wandering through arid terrain. The years passed, and Asa saw his people flourish. The fields yielded abundant crops, the streets became safer, and the cities grew. Trade prospered, caravans passed through the gates bringing riches, and the people began to feel the difference between living under the shadow of strange gods and dwelling under the protection of the true God. The land that had once been plunged into instability was now experiencing a time of order and harmony. But Asa was not a naive king. He knew that peace wouldn't last forever. Other kingdoms were always watching Judah, waiting for any sign of weakness to attack. There were those who saw his devotion to God as a sign of vulnerability. So Asa decided to act before any enemy could even think of threatening them. He reinforced the walls of the cities, erected watchtowers, and strengthened the gates. Judah's army was prepared as never before. Men were trained, weapons were forged, strategies were drawn up. Asa didn't see this as a lack of faith. On the contrary, he knew that trusting in God didn't mean standing by and waiting for the worst to happen. He acted prudently because he understood that faith and preparation go hand in hand. And so, for years, Judah remained untouchable. No army dared challenge such a well-structured kingdom. The enemies watched from a distance, waiting for an opportunity. They knew that Asa was strong, but they also knew that even the most prepared of kings could be tested. And when the first big challenge appeared on the horizon, it came like an overwhelming storm. Suddenly, the scouts brought the news. An army was marching against Judah. But it wasn't just any army. Zerah, the Ethiopian, was coming from the south with 1 million soldiers and 300 chariots. It was an absurd number, an overwhelming force that seemed to swallow up everything in its path. The dust raised by the march of the enemy warriors could be seen from afar, and rumors of their fury spread quickly. The men of Judah were trained, their cities were fortified, but how could they prepare for such a great threat? How to face a crowd that seemed as countless as the grains of sand in the desert? Fear began to spread among the soldiers. Some wondered if the peace they had enjoyed for so many years hadn't made them complacent. Asa, however, was undeterred. He knew that his strength lay not only in the army he had prepared, nor in the walls he had erected. His true refuge was in God. So, in a gesture that few kings would make before a battle, Asa knelt down. There, before his people, before his warriors, before heaven itself, he cried out, "Lord, you alone can help the weak against the strong. Help us, O Lord our God, for in you we trust. In your name we have come against this immense army. Don't let man prevail against you." Silence overtook the camp. Asa had given the battle into the Lord's hands. Now all that remained was to wait and see how God would respond. And the answer would come, not as a whisper, but as thunder that would shake the foundations of the earth. The silence that followed Asa's prayer seemed to stretch over the whole earth. But then, as if heaven itself had bent down to listen, something began to happen. The Ethiopian army, immense and powerful, advanced with confidence. Its soldiers laughed, certain that they would crush Judah effortlessly. After all, 1,000,000 against a small kingdom. It was almost a joke. Their war chariots cut through the ground, kicking up dust, and their spears shone under the scorching sun. They were ready to destroy everything in their path. But just as the confrontation seemed inevitable, something changed. An inexplicable panic began to spread among the enemy ranks. First, it was a whisper, then an uproar, screams, confusion. The Ethiopian warriors, so organized until then, began to stumble over each other as if an invisible force was in their midst. Asa and his soldiers watched in disbelief. That sea of enemies was falling apart before their eyes. They had done nothing but trust in God, and now the battle seemed to be being won without them even raising their swords. It was then that Asa gave the order, "Attack." The men of Judah advanced, full of courage, knowing that they were not fighting alone. And what happened next was something that would be told for generations. The Ethiopians, once imposing, fell one by one. They were pursued, defeated, and scattered across the desert. The army that had come to destroy them was itself destroyed. No enemy resisted. When the dust settled and silence reigned, Asa and his men were surrounded by a sight that few kings had ever witnessed. Not only had they won an impossible war, but they were also faced with untold riches left by their enemies in their flight. The loot was so great that the men could barely carry it. The march back to Judah was unlike any other. The soldiers not only carried the spoils of war, but something even greater, the certainty that God had fought for them. Every step echoed the victory. Every glance between the warriors was a silent testimony to what they had seen. But Asa knew that, at times like these, it was easy to get lost in the glory of conquest and forget what really mattered. Then, as they approached Jerusalem, something unexpected happened. A man appeared on the road. He wasn't wearing armor, he wasn't wielding a sword, and yet his presence seemed stronger than that of any warrior. It was Azariah, the prophet. His eyes reflected something that Asa could not ignore. Without hesitation, he approached and began to speak. "The Lord is with you as long as you are with him. If you seek him, you will find him. But if you leave him, he will leave you too." The words cut through the air like sharp blades. The message was clear. The war had been won because Asa trusted in the Lord. But that trust could not be momentary. The real danger was not just from enemy armies. The real risk was letting the heart turn away from what brought victory. Asa listened to every word, and deep down, he knew it was a calling. It wasn't enough just to destroy idols, drive out false gods, or win impossible battles. True transformation had to be continuous. It had to be renewed every day. Without hesitation, Asa made a decision. If God had spoken, then he would listen, and more than that, he would act. The king gathered the people together and made a covenant. Everyone in Judah was to seek the Lord sincerely, with all their heart, with all their soul. And it wasn't a suggestion, it was a commitment. And as the voices of the people echoed in oath, Asa felt that Judah was standing firm again. But he also knew that no alliance is tested only in the days of peace. Sooner or later, a new challenge would come, and he had to be ready. The years passed, and Judah experienced a stability that few kingdoms have known. The people were safe, the army was strong, and Asa's name was respected throughout the region. He had made a covenant with God, and the prosperity that followed seemed like living proof that this covenant was real. But it is in times of peace that the human heart is most at risk, because that is when vigilance relaxes and temptations whisper quietly. It was then that a new threat arose, not from the south as before, but from the north itself, where Israel, the neighboring kingdom and distant brother, began to move against Judah. Baasha, king of Israel, didn't like Asa's growing strength. He knew that every day Judah prospered was a day when his own kingdom weakened. So he made a bold decision. He began to fortify the city of Ramah, right on the border with Judah. Ramah was no ordinary city. It was strategically positioned, like a knife pressed against Judah's throat. If Baasha finished building it, he would have total control over the trade routes and prevent any communication between Judah and its allies to the north. It was a silent but deadly blockade. Asa saw this and knew he had to act, but this time something was different. Instead of turning to the Lord as he had done in the past, instead of falling on his knees and crying out as he had in the war against the Ethiopians, he looked at his riches, the gold from the temple, the silver from the royal coffers, all that could be used to solve the problem without a single shed of blood. And so Asa did something he had never done before. He took the treasures from the house of God and sent them to Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, asking for help. The message was clear. We've broken our covenant with Israel. Now we want one with you. The plan was cunning, and indeed, it would work. But the question wasn't just whether it would work. The question was, did Asa still trust as before? Asa's strategy worked exactly as he had planned. Ben-Hadad accepted the gold, broke his alliance with Israel, and attacked their cities to the north. Panicked, Baasha abandoned Ramah and fled, leaving his unfinished building behind. Asa, wasting no time, took the stones and wood left behind and used them to strengthen Judah even more. In the eyes of the people, it was a brilliant move, a masterstroke. The king had won without even having to lift a sword. But not everything was as it seemed. It wasn't long before a new visitor arrived at the palace, and he didn't bring good news. Hanani, the seer, entered without hesitation and looked into Asa's eyes. His voice was firm, and his words sharp. Because you trusted in the king of Syria and not in the Lord your God, the army of Israel has turned away from you. Was it not the Lord who delivered the Ethiopian army into your hands when you cried out to him? Why didn't you trust him now? From now on, you will have wars. The impact was immediate. Asa, who had previously humbled himself before the Lord in times of crisis, now hardened his heart. He didn't like the rebuke. How could that seer question him after all he had done for Judah? Anger rose in his chest like an uncontrollable fire. He wouldn't listen. He didn't want to acknowledge his mistake. In an act of pure rage, he had Hanani arrested. But something had changed. The same king who had removed idolatry, who had cried out for deliverance on the battlefield, now refused to listen to correction. The heart that had once sought God above all else now began to drift away, little by little. Years passed, and Asa was no longer the courageous young king who had destroyed the idols and cried out to the Lord in the midst of war. Time weighed heavily on his shoulders, and the heart that had once been completely devoted to God was now hardened. The man who had once trusted in the Lord to defeat an unimaginable army now relied only on his own strength and human alliances. It was then that the illness came. First, a slight pain in his feet, one that anyone would ignore. But as the days passed, it became unbearable. Doctors were called in, the best in the kingdom, but nothing seemed to solve it. Asa, who had faced kings and armies, was now fighting a silent battle against something that could not be defeated with swords or strategies. What was most striking was not the seriousness of the illness, but the king's attitude towards it. He didn't seek God. He didn't pray, he didn't cry out, he didn't ask the Lord for help, as he had done in the past. He relied solely on doctors, treatments, and human cures. Not that it was wrong to seek help, but Asa, who had once put his faith above all else, now acted as if he no longer needed the God who had once rescued him. The days turned into months, months turned into years. The disease never left him, and he never turned his heart to God. Until one day, his time came. The king who began with such faith, who led his people in righteousness, who won impossible wars, died without ever having fully trusted in the Lord again. Asa was buried with honor among the kings of Judah. His people mourned his departure, remembering the time of peace he had guaranteed. The battles won, the cities fortified. Many considered him a great king, and indeed he was. But for those who knew his story in full, there was something to reflect on. He began his journey as a leader who trusted entirely in God. He was bold in removing the idols, ruthless in restoring the people's faith, and courageous in facing an army that seemed impossible to defeat. Asa saw miracles, felt God's hand leading Judah, and experienced peace as a reward for his faithfulness. But over time, something inside him changed. The man who had already thrown himself at the Lord's feet in humility began to rely more on his own strategy, his strength, and his resources. Perhaps it was the weight of years, perhaps it was the feeling that he had achieved enough, or maybe it was just a heart that, little by little, drifted away without realizing it. First, he sought human alliances instead of divine protection. Then it rejected the correction of a prophet, something it would previously have received as direction from God himself. And in the end, even when the pain took over his body, he chose not to cry out anymore. Asa's story teaches us that a good beginning does not guarantee a good ending, that faith needs to be cultivated every day, because even the most faithful can lose their way when they stop depending on the Lord. He teaches us that trusting in God is not something we do only when we're out of options, but a decision that must accompany us until our last breath. And it asks us a question that echoes far beyond Asa's time, reaching our own day. At the end of our journey, will we be remembered for having remained faithful to the end, or for having let our hearts stray along the way? If you enjoyed King Asa's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.